The body is a precision machine designed for governance. But beneath the conscious mind, an unknown mechanism is issuing new orders. This is not reflex. This is pure, catastrophic biological autonomy. Dr. Clark and Dr. Hayes investigate the profound systemic breakdowns where the corporeal self completely disobeys central command. They track patients experiencing spontaneous paralysis unconnected to injury or radical metabolic shifts triggered by non-emotional stimuli. The brain is intact. The pathways are clear. Yet, the body aggressively overrides its own programming. They seek to locate the extreme feedback loop, the ultimate non-control system that defines the hidden limits of human will. If they succeed, the future of physiology changes forever. The pursuit of understanding autonomous physical reactions demands a complete recalibration of how biological stability is viewed. We are accustomed to thinking of the central nervous system as the ultimate governor, yet the evidence points toward highly specialized, often localized, systemic feedback loops capable of usurping central command. This is not simply a failure of neural communication. Rather, it appears to be an aggressive form of biological self-correction gone profoundly awry, where a regional system asserts its own functional priorities. The hypothesis posits that these catastrophic reactions, be they sudden localized paralysis unconnected to known injury or radical, spontaneous core temperature fluctuations, are manifestations of the body's defense mechanisms reaching a point of hyperbolic, localized response. It is theorized as a last-ditch attempt to maintain equilibrium, even if the resulting symptom cripples the host. The body, perceiving a subtle threat or instability that the conscious mind and established central pathways cannot register or address, isolates the problem area, locking down or overcompensating function as a bizarre, non-standardized survival strategy. Tracking such an elusive mechanism requires radical diagnostic shifts. Traditional imaging and standard physiological assessments often report perfectly healthy neural and vascular pathways, leaving researchers with profound physical event but no identifiable biological source. The methodology necessitates continuous multi-environment monitoring, placing subjects under controlled, yet diverse external conditions to precisely induce and map the trigger point that bypasses established neural routing. The objective is to move beyond mere symptomology and capture the exact moment the non-control mechanism engages, identifying a stimulus that initiates the systemic overthrow. Identifying a standardized pattern within this biological chaos, a reproducible biological signature for these aberrant feedback loops, would fundamentally shift these symptoms from the domain of medical anomaly into predictable, treatable biological science. This research promises to redefine the very limits of corporeal self-governance, demonstrating that the human organism possesses an inherent independence, capable of generating internal biological commands far greater and potentially more disruptive than previously theorized. This extreme autonomy challenges a foundational premise that the brain maintains absolute control over the physical vessel it inhabits. The documentation of profound autonomous reactions compels a radical shift away from traditional, hierarchical understanding of physiological governance. Biological stability must be conceptualized not as a linear, top-down execution of orders from the central nervous system, but as a dynamic, sometimes anarchic network of competing operational priorities where local systems possess unexpected levels of functional veto power. The body, in this light, behaves less like a unified monarchy and more like a collection of fiercely independent biological republics. The baffling nature of the triggers for these systemic overthrows further complicates the traditional diagnostic landscape. These profound reactions are often initiated by stimuli so mundane, a specific shift in ambient light frequency, a marginal fluctuation in atmospheric pressure, or the presence of non-emotional, subtle auditory cues, that they would normally be filtered out by standard physiological gatekeepers. This hypersensitization suggests an inherent, often genetically anchored propensity for these autonomous feedback loops to form. It is hypothesized that the mechanism for developing a functional non-control mechanism resides in subtle genetic variances. These variances may predispose regional cellular clusters or localized neural pathways to prioritize immediate, localized crisis management over strict adherence to central neural directives. This is not necessarily a failure of communication, but a difference in biological prioritization architecture, a system designed to aggressively solve a regional stability problem. even if the resulting solution manifests as catastrophic paralysis or uncontrolled thermal instability for the host organism. If the origin is purely architectural and rooted in inherited systemic priorities rather than a trauma or pathogen, the diagnostic and therapeutic challenge escalates significantly. Researchers are not attempting to treat a disease. They are mapping an alternate, emergent biological command structure. Treatment must shift from simple suppression to profound reintegration. A systematic approach focused on negotiating the demands of the localized system with the central command, thereby reestablishing unified corporeal governance. This work demands that physiologists acknowledge the limits of the brain's absolute sovereignty over the physical vessel it inhabits. The diagnostic bottleneck resides fundamentally in the domain of predictive modeling. When the trigger for a systemic veto is a variable as infinitesimal as a specific shift in ambient light frequency or an atmospheric pressure deviation of 3 Pascal, the entire framework of medical causality collapses. Traditional medicine relies on strong, reproducible correlatives. These autonomous responses offer only statistical noise, where the anomaly is a predictable pattern, predictably unpredictable. These localized crises are not merely functional glitches. They are hyper-aggressive reallocations of metabolic resources. When a regional system, perhaps a specific nerve cluster or muscle group, initiates a catastrophic paralysis or a sudden, radical thermal shift, it is effectively declaring a state of localized biological martial law. This declaration requires an immediate, energy-intensive sequestering of glucose and oxygen, starving other systems that rely on the established central command structure. The physical symptom, the tremor, the profound localized paralysis, the spontaneous metabolic upheaval, is merely the observable fallout of an internal resource war fought at the cellular level. The objective thus shifts away from forceful suppression or rewiring and toward achieving systemic détente. It is a form of biological negotiation where the goal is to convince the autonomous region that the localized threat it perceives is not existential, thereby allowing it to relinquish its catastrophic defensive mechanism. This requires creating a therapeutic interface capable of communicating complex assurances directly to the localized system, bypassing the traditional sensory pathways and cognitive input entirely. We are, in effect, attempting to code a truce into the very architecture of cellular priority, a programming update that validates the system's defensive capacity while simultaneously subordinating it to unified needs of the host. This effort necessitates a complete restructuring of how biological stability is defined. If stability is merely the absence of noticeable catastrophic events, the system is deemed functional. However, if true corporeal governance requires absolute, centralized obedience, then these individuals represent a fundamental biological failure state. The research must ultimately concede that biological independence is far more pervasive and hard-coded than previously understood, forcing us to acknowledge that the human body may be designed with inherent, radical fail-safes that prioritize local survival over unified host stability, perpetually challenging the concept of a single, indivisible corporeal self. Hit like for the content and subscribe for the journey.